Good afternoon, everybody, including the honorable dignitaries and my beloved friends from the bar and bench. Today is the 76th session of Lex webinar series, and this time we are joining hands with Legal Eagle Alliance run by Adalashmi Logamurthy Advocate Chennai, and we are very happy to have her as the co-host of this program. And may I now request Ms. Adalakshmi Logamurthy of Legal Eagle Alliance to welcome the chief guest and the gathering formally. Madam, you are welcome.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of Lex webinar series and also our Legal Allies, we extend a warm welcome to today's guest of honor, Honorable Justice Dama Sheshadri Naidu, sir, a Judge, Bombay High Court. We welcome you, sir, on behalf of two webinar organizers who started during the COVID-19, along with Brother Advocate Srinivasa Raghavan, sir, and my dear friend Hemalata Madam. We extend a warm welcome to every one of the participants who are present here. We have honorable judges from the subordinate judiciary, we have senior advocates, we have junior colleagues, and also the law students who have joined in a huge number, and many are joining in too, sir. Thank you so much, Srinivasa Raghavan, sir, for making Legal Allies also a co-host for the first time. It is indeed a great pleasure to have such a great legal luminary as the first guest in our joint venture, and I deem it as a great privilege bestowed upon us. Thank you, sir. I welcome you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you, Madam, for your warm and simple and precise welcome address. Now, may I request Ms. Hemalata Advocate to introduce the chief guest to the participants. Hemalata, ma'am, you are welcome.
Yes, thank you, Srinivasa Raghavan. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you, my lords. My lords need no introduction as such, but I have to say a few words about your lordship. My lords, born on 19th June 1962 at Ganganakunda, a hamlet away from Tirupati, the holy pilgrim town, Chittoor district, Andhra Pradesh. My lords did his graduation from Andhra University, Vaisheshagapattinam. Later, he obtained the law degree from Sri Venkateshwara University, Tirupati. My lords got enrolled as a member of the Bar Council of Andhra Pradesh in March 1997. Originally, my lords practiced in Tirupati. Later, having shifted practice in early 2000 to Hyderabad, he started practice in the High Court of Andhra Pradesh, as well as the city and criminal courts in the city. My lords represented many corporate entities, nationalized banks, and practiced in offices of law. My lords got himself associated with AP Judicial Academy, Hyderabad, as a guest faculty and taught various subjects, notably Hindu Succession Act, 1956, and Negotiable Instrument Act, 1881. My lords authored a few law books, such as The Law of Stamp Duty and Registration in Andhra Pradesh and the Andhra Pradesh Educational Code. Besides, he co-reviewed MP Jain's Indian Constitutional Law, 2 volumes, 7th edition, 2017. So my lords, achievement is on and on. Welcome your lordship, and welcome your lordship on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Hemalata, for the warm, short yet sweet introduction about the chief guest. And it's all about a story that has been fascinating, a story that has proved to be a milestone in the history of and annals of judiciary, first in US and thereafter in the entire world. Those who believe in democracy have to be an ardent reader of the stories like this. And storytelling is an art. And we have got a chief guest who is a judge of his own caliber. I'm not exaggerating. Whenever I say that today we have Justice Seshadri Naidu as the chief guest, most of the colleagues of Madras High Court said, wow, a beautiful occasion and a very good learned resource person. So that is the best introduction we can have. And the story of William Marbury and James Madison, Secretary of State of the United States, a case law that has paved the way for a revolution in the judicial history. Now may I request Honorable Mr. Justice Dama Sheshadri Naidu to start his deliberations. Sir, we seek your blessings, and sir, the deliberation may commence, and the forum is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening, friends. I've been following this webinar series for many months, and I know that the audience is across India. But the organizers or the hosts are basically from Tamil Nadu. Let me share one secret about my personal life. My ancestors hail from Kanchi.
Wow.
And I always joke, if I were to contest elections from North Arcot, I would win because the whole district was my relatives.
That's very nice of you, sir.
Friends, it's a weekend. By now, I've been weakened by our daily grinding. I hope the fun has not been lost. The whole week you had been busy with online hearing, preparation, presentation, again preparation and presentation, eventually exhaustion. It's time to relax. It's time you enjoyed your weekend. Maybe a movie, but thanks to the pandemic, that's ruled out. Then TV, again, with nothing fresh. The TVs are recirculating their previous programs. Then a storybook, but it needs you to focus. Sit attentively and read. Instead, let's think of an alternative. How about listening to a story or stories? So here goes the story, rather one of the stories. Let me tell you about a hungry king. Once, a king went a hunting, and he was after the game till late in the afternoon. By then he was famishing with hunger. He rushed back to the palace. Then the royal chef served him some food hot on the plate, and the specialty was the brinjal curry. You can call it aubergine or eggplant or brinjal. Every continent has its own name though. And pretty well, the king was very hungry. He relished it. After all, hunger doesn't know much of taste. So he rewarded the royal chef some jewel. Then onwards, the royal chef went on serving the same brinjal curry. When he initially praised that one, next to him was standing the Vidushakan, the royal jester. He said, the purpose of that man always, he is a yes man. He would always tell whatever the king says, he would endorse it. Then he said, yes, your royal highness, brinjal after all is the king of vegetables. That's why God has put a crown on its head. What happened later? This royal chef took a cue from it, but he overdid it. He went on serving the same curry every day. And one day the king lost his cool and just chided or abused that man. What the hell are you doing? You have been serving the same thing every day. Then everybody was looking at this royal chef because the king started saying, I hate this brinjal or eggplant. Then what should this man say? Everybody was looking at him. He said, yes, your royal highness, that was a very bad vegetable. That's why God has put a chisel on its head. But friends, why I said this is precisely for this reason. So many legal luminaries, scholars from every front have adorned this platform, this webinar hosted by two of you. And they have said enough about law. And I'm not the Vidushkan to have the skill to say the same thing again and just convince you. I chose the safe path of telling a simple story, but no law involved in it. Please rest assured, I will not be spoiling your weekend. You are not my captive audience. There are advantages and disadvantages when it comes to webinars. If we're addressing each other, the speaker can always look at the face of the listener, whether he's interested, bored, or sleepy, whatever, so that he could modulate. Now, I don't have the advantage. At the same time, when you feel bored, certainly you will be in course of time of my discussion, you may feel a little shy to walk away in the face of the speaker. But here, it's online, faceless, you simply can walk away, you have that freedom. Please do that whenever you feel like. Now, Storytelling agreed. Let me tell about a story. But before this, you must have heard about the Bethal stories of Vikramaditya. You know, Vikramaditya was very tenacious. He would go get the corpse on his shoulder. He would be walking. That would tell a story. He would answer it correctly. It would go back to the tree. It went on and on. But Vikramaditya was relentless. And that is Srinivas Raghavanji. Last 5 months, he'd been asking me, please be a part of it. I am like that corpse or that spirit that refused. And at last he tamed me. I agreed. If at all somebody has to write or rather deliver a lecture on auto persuasion, he is the right person. Thank you, Raghavanji.
Yes, sir.
In my story, there are characters. You call them dramatis personae or the characters in the drama. Let me tell you about those characters first so that you'll have a fair amount of idea how this story unfolds with real human beings. First, John Adams. He was the second president of the USA. Then Thomas Jefferson. He was the third president. John Marshall, the third Chief Justice and the Chief Justice forever. Marbury, a congressman or an MP in our language, to be appointed as Justice of Peace. Then James Madison, the Secretary of State, we can call a foreign minister. He was one of the co-authors of the Federalist Papers. Then the next character could be Charles Lee. He was a former Attorney General and counsel for Marbury in this drama. Then Levi Lincoln, the incumbent Attorney General. Now, there are other minor characters. I'll come to them by and by as the story unfolds. If you happen to visit Washington, D.C., the US Capitol, White House is on one side, and the Capitol, or like our Parliament building, on the other side. In between lies a road. That road is appropriately called the Constitution Avenue. And that avenue has National Archives. If we visit the National Archives, first we see a 13th century copy of the Magna Carta. You know pretty well about it. The British decree from 2012-15, King John's Royal Assent to Human Rights, if we can call them in those terms. Then the very first document on the display was the original copy of the Declaration of Independence. Then comes the original copy of the Constitution. And later, we witness the original Bill of Rights. All these have had their moments in history and their influence forever. But strangely, next to that, there is one judgment, a copy of the judgment, that is Marbury versus Madison. And it says underneath, it's one of the cornerstones of the American constitutional history. Don't you think it's a rare honor for a judgment, a mere precedent which can be overturned at any point in time, to be a monument in a nation's history? And you know, this case arose in the midst of a bitter enmity between a new president, Thomas Jefferson, and a new Chief Justice, John Marshall. And incidentally, this John Marshall is Thomas Jefferson's cousin. This decision symbolizes not only the judicial craft, but also political acumen. in one word, it demonstrates the American Supreme Court's statecraft. It avoided a futile confrontation between a weak court and a strong president. But at the same time, it exposed Jefferson government's lawless actions. It did not give Jefferson, however, an opportunity for defense. There lies the catch. This is a constitutional totem, if I can call it. If you check, a totem is a symbol or object with spiritual significance. But let's not forget, what is a totem for some is a taboo for others. Then in the nascent USA, this decision is a totem for the judicial power and a taboo for the executive power. Later, it has inspired the US Supreme Court's greatest decisions that were to follow, besides improving the written constitutions across the common law world. You know that one. And incidentally, this was the first case in which the American Supreme Court conducted trial. My friends, you all know that in 1789, there was a constitutional convention that ratified the American Constitution. Then the Supreme Court was conceived as a co-equal branch of the government on the same levels as the president representing the executive and the Congress. But it was not to be so until Marbury versus Madison actually took place. That's why it has its place in history. It vividly symbolizes the rule of law. But this case is not a mere precedent, even in constitutional terms. It's much more. It's John Marshall versus Thomas Jefferson. It's the Chief Justice versus the President. It's the court versus the executive. It is the Federalists, I'll come to the history of Federalists, versus the Republicans. And also it's between the proponents of a strong central government versus the proponent of states' rights. It was a case heard following the country's first truly contested election. The election of 1801 was the first in which power was transferred from one party to another, a rival party. Marbury versus Madison wouldn't have happened had it not been for these extraordinary circumstances. And it was decided by 6 unelected judges, as they could be called, and they were appointed by sheer political patronage. If I could dig a little deeper, before the elections in 1800, John Adams was the president and Thomas Jefferson was the vice president. Actually, the contest was between Adams and Jefferson. Who secured more votes became the president. With fewer votes became the vice president. And the difference was only 3 votes. Then the president Adams contested as a candidate of Democratic Party. The vice president contested on the seat of Republican Party. You know pretty well this Democratic Party was chiefly the Federalist Party, and they in fact got the liberation, and they were the constitution drafters and everything. Jefferson was part of it. Later he differed, and that's why he became a Republican. Then in 1800, in the second election, Adams lost with a wide margin though. But there was a tangle. Who should be the next president? Because Jefferson contested. At the same time, Aaron Burr was his presidential running mate. In American Constitution, always it is the president and a running mate would be contesting. Then there was no amendment to the constitution. So there was no clarity among these who should be the president. The convention always said among these two candidates who secured less or fewer votes could be the vice president. Here, Jefferson and Burr secured the same number of votes in the Electoral College. And Burr refused to withdraw his nomination. And that led to a stalemate. As the Constitution stood then, if at all there was such a tie, it is the House of Representatives that would decide who would be the president. But almost for about 6 or 8 months, there was no session for the Congress. So Jefferson had to wait with narrow-raking tension to know his fate. At the same time, Adams, the outgoing president, got an opportunity to hang around in the position and to do something which he wouldn't have been otherwise able to do. But before anything could happen, the then Chief Justice, Oliver Ellsworth, he was the second Chief Justice, he resigned because he wanted to lead a quiet life or he wanted to pursue his political ambition. Then President asked a governor of another state, that's New York, by name John Jay, to be the Chief Justice. Please remember, this John Jay was the first Chief Justice. When he was in office as a Chief Justice, he contested to the post of governorship, lost it. Then second time again he contested, he won, resigned, and then became the governor. But Adams again wanted him to be the Chief Justice. Eventually, Ellsworth, rather John Jay, beg your pardon, John Jay wrote back to the president that he was not interested. You know, the reason for this was this. Why John Jay resigned in the first place? Why Ellsworth resigned later? Why nobody was coming forward to be the Chief Justice of a Supreme Court in America, the Supreme Court? Simply this. By 1800, Supreme Court was virtually non-existent. And all the 6 judges sat only twice a year. And the entire length could be 2 or 3 weeks. And the rest of the time, they would be riding the circuit. Riding the circuit means each judge would go across the country, a vast country as such, and decide cases individually. So on this process, they wouldn't have any facility. On very bad roads, they had to travel days on end. They had to accommodate themselves in rickety hotels, bawdy houses, and most of them became ill in that process. And one judge of 6 became terminally ill, in fact. So most of them resigned. In fact, of the 6 judges that were appointed by Washington, the president, by 1800, only 1 judge remained in office. That was the position. So nobody was coming forward. Then this John Jay wrote to the president that he did not want to be considered for that one. He refused. And he sent the communication to the president's Secretary of State. At the beginning, I said Secretary of State could be likened to a foreign minister in our political parlance. And incidentally, that Secretary of State happened to be John Marshall, himself a congressman, an MP rather, and later he was appointed into the cabinet of Adams. So he carried the news to president. By then, John Marshall was 45 years old. You know the famous saying, shoot the messenger. Sometimes if you carry the tidings of unpleasantness, naturally the person who hears that news would be venting his anger even against the person who brought the tidings or the news. But here, Adams did not shoot the messenger. Instead, he asked John Marshall to be the Chief Justice. And Marshall agreed. As I could say, the rest is history. But let me proceed. It was 1800. It was the election year. The previous was 1796. Adams won. 1800, again election. 1796, Washington was not the capital. Later it was decided that it should be made the capital. Washington as a city was non-existent. It was called from the neighboring Virginia and other ones as a small extent. You know, when they started the capital, there were about 3,000 people living there, including all officials put together. Then half finished was the White House. Adams did not occupy that initially. Because of the elections, he went about the country electioneering. He kept the Secretary of State, Marshall, as his deputy. So he was overseeing the operations of city building, capital shifting and everything. And he had no proper accommodation to stay in Washington. So he occupied the half-finished or less than half-finished White House. So incidentally, John Marshall, then the Secretary of State, soon to be the Chief Justice, was the first occupant of White House. That's the irony. Then election was over. John Adams shifted into the White House. Within a couple of weeks, he lost power. So he had to move out. But before that, as I told you, there was a stalemate between, or a tie between Jefferson and Burr. So he had the necessary breathing time. Now you kindly see, Marshall was the Secretary of State. Then Adams, the outgoing president, as they called him the lame duck president, asked him to be the Chief Justice. With his consent, he was nominated. But until he handed over the reins, Adams asked Marshall to be both the Secretary of State, that means a minister in his cabinet, and also the Chief Justice. In the present days, it's absolutely unthinkable. Right. Let me proceed further what happened. By then, Jefferson, first as the vice president, had deep differences with John Adams. He was a liberal, unlike Adams. So he differed on many accounts. But all the Republicans who were to assume office soon did not object to Marshall's nomination as the Chief Justice, because he was perceived to be moderate among the extreme right wing, if you can call it, Federalists or the Democrats. There is one more reason why Adams rushed through this appointment The Congress introduced a legislature, that's Judicature Act of 1801, which said, rather reduced the number of judges of the Supreme Court from 6 to 5. So with Ellsworth's resignation, before that act could take hold and effect, unless the 6th judge was appointed, forever there would be only 5 judges. And among those 5, one would be the Chief Justice. And the senior most judge then had a lot of political rivalry with Adams. So he was hell-bent on appointing somebody to be the Chief Justice. And that somebody happened to be John Marshall. What a quirk of fate, but they changed the constitutional face forever across the globe. Now let me see. Adams had time on his hand, to be precise 2 weeks before he could demit his office. Then he wanted to reward his fellow Federalists or Democrats with posts. So he commissioned his trusted lieutenant, that is John Marshall, to assist him in this process of filling up all vacancies across the board. Friends, let me tell you about John Marshall, because perhaps he's the hero of our story. He's the eldest of 15 children to his parents. And he's a very jolly person by disposition. He never earned an enemy and always carried people along with him. Please, when he was on the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice, in his biography, there was an incident narrated. One day he was walking on the road. Then an elderly person was carrying groceries. He had to carry them miles on a sticky road, physically. And he mistook Marshall as a porter. And he hired his services. And Marshall, without a word, accepted that offer, carried 6.2 was his height. He was 45, 46 then, carried the provisions, and in the end accepted the tip offered by that man. And about his credentials to be impartial. When he was a Federalist, there was a discussion on a Sedition Act with which Adams became notorious. Please remember, it is the Federalists that introduced the Constitution. It is the Federalists that introduced the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, and also the Federalists under the presidency of Adams introduced this draconian legislation called Sedition Act. And when there was a voting on that one for its renewal, Marshall voted against it when he was a congressman. He acted against his party's interest there because that was draconian. Right. Let me see. Despite his affability, his good humor nature, and his propensity to earn friends, he had one pet bête noire or object of hatred, that is, you can guess, Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson.
And you know the relationship? Jefferson was Marshall's second cousin, if you call it once removed. That is, Jefferson's grandfather and Marshall's great-grandfather were the real blood brothers. There is one more twist in the tale. Marshall's mother-in-law was the first fiancée of Thomas Jefferson. He jilted her. She never forgave him. And perhaps she had a revenge through her son-in-law. That was the background when it comes to relationship. And also, politically, they were supposed to be poles apart. Friends, an incident about the sarcasm or the bitterness that always passed between them with no love lost. When Jefferson was the vice president, Marshall was the Secretary of State. You know that. On an official purpose, Jefferson had to visit the hotel in Washington where Marshall was temporarily put up. Twice he went, he could not find him. Then he left a note. That note would read, I was so lucky to find Marshall was out on both occasions. Then, as an afterthought, just to provoke, before lucky, he put un as an added one. I was unlucky. But the message was sent loud and clear. Well, friends, that being the background between these two great personalities, let's see how Adams added fuel to the fire. Marshall became the Chief Justice. It was in January 1801. He also continued to be the Secretary of State. Then before his term could end, Adams wanted to fill all the posts. So he went on filling up post after post. And a few of them were judges to circuit courts, to appellate courts, and also justices of peace. These justices of peace could be likened to our executive magistrate, or if you say the magistrate of judicial second class. They don't have vast judicial powers. They don't even get much pelf with that one, but they combine the executive and the executive and the judicial functions. And on March 4th was the last date for Adams to demit the office, to have Jefferson as the next president. 4th was the date. On third night, Adams appointed about 53 or 54 judges. And a few of them are justices of peace. They're called midnight judges. He asked, he signed, he sealed, and he delivered them to his Secretary of State, Marshall, to complete the ministerial process of communicating the orders to the appointees. One more twist. Secretary of State had his staff, 2 senior clerks who would be looking after these things. But the President designate Jefferson requested the Secretary of State Marshall that he should be given 1 senior clerk to help him prepare for the swearing in. So 1 staff gone. So what happened? There was only 1. It was too much for him to handle that, because Adams was signing the documents or warrants late into night. Then they were sent to Marshall. Marshall had to again do the ministerial work of entering them into the ledger, register, and other things, then delivering them. He was left with only 1 staff. He was inadequate. Then he requested his own brother, who was also appointed as a midnight judge, to assist him in the process. So they both completed the process and delivered, but under the pressure, they could not deliver all of them. About 5 of the appointments remained unserved. They were left on the table. Then next day morning, new president came. Friends, those 4 people never got it. It was because of the delay on the part of the Secretary of State,
Secretary of State.
Marshall.
Gosh.
And later, as you can see, nobody took note of those missing warrants. Time went by. On the 4th, President had to take oath, Jefferson. He asked for the first time his cousin and rival, Marshall, to administer oath. Then he agreed. He administered oath. Before he could appoint his own ministers, again he asked Marshall to continue as an interim Secretary of State besides being the Chief Justice. So he continued. Eventually, he made proper appointments. Then what happened? He appointed the Secretary of State, that is Madison. He's a legendary personality, you can come to know about that man. And also he appointed his Attorney General, that was Levi Lincoln. That way, Marshall confined himself to be the Chief Justice alone, nothing beyond. In fact, Madison, the next Secretary of State who succeeded Marshall, was called the father of American Constitution. He was also co-author of Federalist Papers along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. I need not repeat those things, just to underline the stature of this man who succeeded Marshall, that's Madison. Friends, one day, Jefferson noticed a few sealed covers lying on the table. And he picked them up, checked them. Jefferson noticed these undelivered covers and they simply ordered them to be destroyed. It's believed to be so. Then Jefferson, you know pretty well, when there was voting among scholars to reckon or to rank the most brainy persons on earth ever born, Jefferson was ranked 4 and Shakespeare ranked number 10, the author of Declaration of Independence. But he was not part of the American Constitution because he was serving as the ambassador of France then. And why I said this one was about the undelivered letters and the nullity of the warrant when it's not been delivered. He said, if there is any principle of law never yet contradicted, it is that delivery is one of the essentials to validity of the deed. Although signed and sealed, yet as long as it remains in the hands of the party himself, it is incomplete. It is not a deed and can be made so only by its delivery. And he called Adams' action indecent conduct. Now let me come back to the judicial functions of Marshall. It's all a prelude or a build-up to this case. I have said there was no love lost between Marshall and Jefferson. So was the case between Adams and Jefferson. And Adams wanted to fill all the important positions with late-night appointments, including the judicial posts. And Jefferson was furious at those developments. But let me tell you about the jovial nature of Marshall. I've already told that when he was thought to be a porter, he acted as a porter and accepted the tip. And also, during the intervals, he ensured that all judges sat together and had their lunch. Friends, when the Capitol was designed, there was a building for the president. There was a building called Capitol for the Congress. but there was no building for the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court was a non-entity up to 1803 when Marbury versus Madison was decided. And in a building, 2 rooms were given for Supreme Court. One for their sitting, another for their retiring. All of them put together. Most of them preferred until then to reside in their lodges, come to that single cramped, dimly lit room and leave. Because they were sitting 2 to 3 weeks in the entire year in 2 spells. But Marshall ensured all of them stayed together and dined together. And also he was the first one, though he was the 3rd Chief Justice, to introduce the method of concurring judgments instead of each judge writing his own judgment. That's why it has come to be called Marshall's Court. And during lunchtime, he always loved his wine. The other judges protested. If at all we take everyday wine, we would feel sleepy. That would interfere with our duties. So let's keep it. Then Marshall said, all right, we'd have it whenever it was raining. They agreed. Then another great judge, Justice Story. Story's Constitution was the landmark first commentary. Justice Story narrated one thing. Every day he would call his brother judges to the window and would ask them, is it raining? Sometimes it would be raining. Sometimes it wouldn't be. They would say, it's not raining. No, there you see it's raining. They say, no, it's very sunny. But brothers, we are the judges of a vast territory. Somewhere else it must be raining. Why not have wine? That was the Chief Justice. Right, my friends? His first contribution to the judiciary was a case called Talbot versus Seaman. That itself presaged or foreshadowed his brilliance. Now, I am coming to the drama, and I say how it has begun. On December 16th, 1801, Marshall's former colleague, ex-Attorney General, his name was Charles Lee. He made a mention before the Supreme Court that 4 persons were denied appointment, rather denied an opportunity to assume office despite their appointment by the outgoing president. So he sought mandamus to the present Secretary of State, that is Madison, that they should be allowed to assume office. Notice was put. Then Levi Lincoln, the Attorney General, appeared and he took notice. But remember, as is the case now, when it comes to mandamus, either inaction or action must be preceded by the efforts on the part of the aggrieved to stir the authorities into action. So first, these 4 people, including Marbury, went to the Secretary of State, but he refused. Then they went before the Senate and petitioned. They also ignored. Then they moved the court through their counsel. Then, when Lee presented the motion, Levi's the Attorney General, his successor. For the petitioners, the former Attorney General. For the state, the present Attorney General. He simply said, I have no instructions. I've informed Madison, the Secretary of State, I have no instructions. Then the court adjourned the matter by a couple of days to decide whether they have the jurisdiction to entertain this if you can call it, a writ petition. 2 days later, they returned and they said, yes, we have prima facie jurisdiction to entertain. So a date was set for the trial. I'll just pass over whatever the development that have happened in between. We're not concerned, though it's been politically quite juicy. Let me confine myself to the actual hearing. Friends, in the next semester, when they sat, the trial began. The two clerks, senior clerks in the office of the Secretary of State were summoned to depose evidence. They initially were reluctant, but court compelled them to give evidence. They gave evidence. Then, cleverly, the petitioners wanted the very Attorney General, that is Lincoln, Levi Lincoln, to be a witness. Because I forgot to tell you one thing. When Marshall demoted his office, before Madison could take charge, the present Attorney General, that is Levi Lincoln, was the interim law secretary or foreign minister or secretary of state. So it all happened in that interregnum. Then they insisted he should be the witness. Then he said there is an executive privilege. He does not want to be examined. A preliminary issue was framed and the court ruled he should be subjected to examination, and that was accepted. He did not say anything beyond telling that, yes, a few warrants were signed and kept, but he did not know what happened to them. The fact remained, he concluded, that they were not served. And the evidence part was over. And no lawyer represented the respondents or the state. Though Attorney General was present, he never participated in the proceedings until he was called as a witness. He gave evidence, and that's of no consequence, though. Eventually, it was the D-Day. Finally, the court ruled on this aspect. What is meant by signing a warrant? What is meant by delivering a warrant? When and how either of the events come into place? All these things. But my friends, here lies the real catch. Please remember the political background. It was in February 1803, the judgment delivered. By then, virtually, Supreme Court was non-existent. And Jefferson, when the case was pending, again amended Judiciary Act and reintroduced the circuit business, the most hated task on the part of the judges, going places and deciding instead of sitting at one place. Then other judges felt it should be rejected. But Marshall said, if we reject that, would be seen as those violating the law. Can we have the moral authority to decide cases? In fact, he saw through the plan of Jefferson. Then he persuaded others to follow the circuit again. Then please see what this case has presented for the Marshall Court. First, by asserting the court's position, he is building an institution. Second thing, he is asserting the independence of the judiciary. Third thing, he can as well have his anti-Jeffersonian dislike imprinted with a decision. So, on the fateful day, I don't exactly remember the date. It could be 27th February, 1803. Marshal started reading the judgment. He formulated 3 questions. The first one is, has the applicant a right to the commission he demands? Please remember, 4 petitioners went before the court. But the case considered only one, that is of Marbury. That's why you don't get the name of the other people in the cause title, because it's in severalty. In a sense, 4 separate petitions were filed. The first one was Marbury's. And incidentally, sometimes you're catapulted into history by sheer accident. For example, with great respect to the recently departed soul, Kesavananda Bharati, when a batch of writ petitions came before the Supreme Court across many states, incidentally, Kesavananda Bharati's case was on top. So the whole case was sought to be called in the name of Kesavananda Bharati. That was the case with Marbury. Please remember, Marbury never visited the court. Only his lawyer represented. Madison never visited the court because there was no representation for the state. But fate threw both of them into the limelight, and that's history. So I said the first question, has the applicant a right to the commission he demands? The second question, if he has a right, and if that right has been violated, do the laws of country afford him a remedy? The second question. The third question is, if they do afford him a remedy, is it a mandamus issuing from this court? That should be the answer. Now, Marshal answered the first question in Marbury's favor. He said, once it is signed and sealed, it's a completed executive act, and the delivery is only ministerial. Right? So the executive's failure to deliver it is of no consequence. Rather, he said that it is the bounden duty of the state to deliver it, and who did not deliver it? He himself. That's the irony. Then he turned to the second question. Marbury has a right, and that right has been violated. As the court had just determined, then he rhetorically put a question. Do the laws of this country afford him a remedy? He said, the very essence of the civil liberty certainly consists in the right of every individual to claim the protection of the laws whenever he receives an injury. He also stressed the government of the United States has been emphatically termed a government of laws and not of men. You could have heard this many a time. He said, the state or the government will certainly cease to deserve this high appellation if the laws furnish no remedy for the aggrieved. So he ruled even on the second question in Marbury's favor. Now let me come to the third question. Remember, it was a ticking time bomb. Marshal ruled on 2 counts in Marbury's favor. If Jefferson stared at Supreme Court with that heat of his gaze, it would disappear into oblivion. That was a shaky position of the Supreme Court. It would be ill-advisable or foolhardy for Marshal and his other brethren to take on the most popular president by then. Then what's the way out? He split this question into 2. The first concerned whether mandamus is the only remedy. The second question is, if it is the only remedy, whether the Supreme Court is competent to grant that remedy. He said, when it comes to the remedies, usually the suitors have two remedies. In their parlance, one is called detinue, the other is called mandamus. Detinue, in our terms, we could call specific performance. Please remember, before independence, before constitution for us, specific performance was the act that governed writs. That was the case there too. So whether Marbury was entitled to detinue or mandamus. Detinue means either the very thing itself or its compensation in terms of money. But when it comes to an office, it could be the very thing. There cannot be any compensation in terms pecuniary. So Marshall's court ruled that detinue would not apply. It is only the mandamus. Then, friends, he read the Constitution. He read the Judiciary Act 1801. Under Judiciary Act, Supreme Court has original jurisdiction vis-a-vis any matter concerning the state and state affairs. But the Constitution has maintained a distinction. So Marshall's genius came to fore here. He said, when there is a conflict between the legislature and the Constitution should prevail. Though Judicature Act of 1801 could endorse that it could have jurisdiction, but that transcended the constitutional limits. Hence, it has held Supreme Court has no original jurisdiction vis-a-vis the private grievance of Marbury. So what has it said? It has rather decided on every count till the last minute in Marbury's favor, but it did not deliver a favorable verdict in terms of relief. That way, what did he do? He averted the confrontation with the executive. And also he denied an opportunity to the executive to defend itself because it was in their favor. That means Marshall's court declared the law for future, but refused to implement in the present case. If you read V.C. Shukla's Constitution of India, there are also interestingly comments when you take Indian history, constitutional history, the first landmark judgments up to Maneka Gandhi, there was no relief for the petitioner. Was declared. So momentous decisions are meant for the future. So this is the genius. But remember, many of us believe that Marbury versus Madison was the first one for rather constitutionally recognizing judicial review. Agreed. But by then, many states in US, first it was 13, then 16 by 803, they had this constitutional review vis-a-vis the legislative power or even the constituent power. And also, if you read Federalist Papers, it's been emphatically held by those who formed the government later that it must have that power. Otherwise, the rule of law would not survive. So, had it not been for Marbury versus Madison, a case of momentous constitutional implications, but without any remedy or succor granted to the litigant, we have seen history made and continue to be made to this day across every common law country where written constitution is the norm. This is the genius. And please pause a moment here and notice we all talk about the principle of bias. No person shall be a judge in his own cause. Kindly apply this principle here. Marshall was the secretary who was instrumental in delivering those warrants. He did not deliver, and he became the Chief Justice. He tried the case where he should have been in the first place a witness. And then he ruled, pretty well. It's commonsensical in ordinary parlance. Once a court lacks inherent jurisdiction, a judgment becomes quorum non judice or void ab initio. In this case, Marbury versus Madison, Supreme Court has held that it has no jurisdiction. That means it's become void. The judgment has no consequence at all if you go by the principle of precedent or stare decisis. But if you apply the same logic, you think of Article 143 of Indian Constitution. It's advisory jurisdiction. Still, and it's non-adversarial, but still it has presidential value. And so is the case with Marbury versus Madison. It was out of a judgment, admittedly from a court that had no inherent jurisdiction to try the matter. That's how it has taken place. That's how Marshall, an unlikely personality who was pushed into the post out of compulsion because Adams did not have much time to think of others or to deliberate. Just because 2 weeks before he could leave the office, he nominated him. Others agreed because they too did not have further time, because the outgoing Congress would not have any majority to think of another Federalist to be on the post. So they've accepted. So the fortuitous circumstances pushed Marshall into the limelight. But remember, he became a Chief Justice at 45. And he continued on the bench for 34 years later. And to this day, he remains the greatest Chief Justice ever that adorned the American Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice has been his permanent appellation. You call every Chief Justice simply by his name or Justice so-and-so. But Marshall is always called the Chief Justice Marshall. And kindly read the judgment. In close print, it would stretch into 50 pages.
Yeah, fine.
A classic of great proportions. How he has declared that it is the court that decides what law is. Aphorisms, whatever that's been said in Marbury versus Madison, they have become aphorisms or adages, wise dicta. And it's profitable for anybody, any aspiring young lawyer, to begin his constitutional career by reading this judgment, the first and perhaps the best. Thank you.
Sir, I want to be very frank. I don't want to say something to flatter you, or the only word must be awesome. I expected a very erudite, and I'm searching words, a scholarly lecture, no doubt. But never I expected this kind of, what I say, exuberant, erudite, and insight of the judgment. See, unless you were able to explain the story behind the case law and the antecedents that led to the appointment or the failure to execute the commission, I think the judgment would not have been understood by the audience the way it was meant to be. And I'm still very grateful to your good self, because to speak on this judgment is not something a simple job, sir. It requires what is called a deep passion or love for the judgment. And even now, I have already circulated the judgment in print form to all the participants last night, so that they may be in a position to follow it closely. And the last penultimate para is still what's called lingering. Thus, the particular phraseology of the conflictuation of the United States confirms the strength of the principle supported to be essential to all the written constitutions, that a law repugnant to the constitution is void, and that courts as well as other departments are bound by that instrument. This is the law that I think came to be a severe, what is called a message to all the departments, not only the courts. That must be the birthplace where the concept of judicial review was emboldened and envisaged and enshrined. And your lecture, sir, is very, very insightful. And I would say that out of the 76 program we have so far hosted, this is one of the top 5. I'm very frank with your good self. And from my bottom of the heart, as a co-host and represent the co-host, I thank your good self for this an insightful session. When you were referring to the detinue and the specific relief act, the question was posed by her in the chat box. We shall be failing in our duty if we fail to express our heartfelt gratitude to the organizer. And she said one question: why specific performance was refused over mandamus? Please, can you explain again? This is a question posed by Advocate Sucheta D from Mumbai.
Yes. I did not address that one specifically because I promised at the beginning that I would be telling only the story,
Not the
not the consequences.
yes, sir.
And the judgment is the consequence of the story. But still, since it's been raised, let me tell. Please remember 1803 was quite nascent. And the constitution itself was an experiment, the written constitution at that. They had the legacy inherited from the English, that's common law. So even when this Sedition Act was abolished or was not renewed, Adams' government continued to prosecute the aliens and the seditious people, as they called them, under common law. Please remember, if you read Chandrachud's, Abhinav Chandrachud's The Republic of Rhetoric, and he has put forward a very novel proposition in that one, that it's his opinion, an author's opinion at that, not the judges, that India enjoyed more liberal atmosphere under the uncodified common law regime than under the constitution with its Article 19 intact. So when it comes to deciding a case, nobody goes by the cold letter of law. It's animated by every conceivable circumstance, including the political milieu or the atmosphere and the institutional position. Here, day one, Marshall knew they had no jurisdiction. State did not participate. There could have been an ex parte order. He did not do. Then the constitutional invalidity of Judicature Act, nobody raised. It was a non-issue. And that permitted the Supreme Court the original jurisdiction. Despite the absence of state's protest on that count, the court suo motu ruled on that aspect and denied itself the jurisdiction. But it served two purposes at the same time. One is, it declared that it has the power to invalidate legislation. That's one thing it has achieved. And also it has said that the rule of law is not negotiable. You by just, I by remedium. When a person has a grievance, he ought to have the remedy for that one. And now let me come to detinue. Well, detinue says it is the same thing, or in the alternative, the compensation. Vis-a-vis the state, holding a post, it's entirely personal. That's why compensation is unthinkable. The only way is ask the state to allow them to discharge their functions, because technically appointment was already made. There's no need to give any particular direction that they should be reappointed. That's why they said that it's the mandamus that should lie. But to have the mandamus, it should be original jurisdiction, as we call extraordinary original jurisdiction under 226. And Supreme Court said, reading the Constitution, vis-a-vis states, interstate disputes, diplomats, foreign countries, and other categories, in all other categories, it has got only appellate jurisdiction. That's why it has read it down. and it has said that the expanded scope in the Judicature Act cannot be sustained. So it's more a contrivance, a judicial contrivance. Call it innovation if you're positive. That has seized the day. Yes, please.
So there is one encomium which I feel that it must be read over. One Sudhir Deshpande. I have 8 dictionaries in my mobile phone, but I couldn't find most appropriate word for Lordship's lecture, even from the pitiable thesaurus. Hence, I had to coin a new word, scripturesque. Scripturesque. But
Yes.
this word is something very interesting, sir.
Oh.
Picturesque, you say scripturesque.
That's
Yes.
called, in English, that's called neologism.
Neologism.
Yes,
I will say that
finding
is
words. And
finding
our
words.
Krishna has been great. Krishna has been created with that one.
That word, I just love it very much, so I just read it over.
Yes.
Yes, and
8
just
dictionaries,
scroll.
that shows he's a philologist, a
He's a
lover of
philologist.
language.
Especially his mobile phone.
Yes.
So once again, with a heartfelt thank, the fond hope of having your good self in one more session of our webinar in the future, let me sign off with a warm goodbye, sir.
Thank you very much, my friends, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.